Joining me from el-Sheikh with a look at the climate divide is Gareth Walsh, head of the energy team at the Tony Blair Institute for Change. Gareth, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you, Esther.
Now, there's so much talk about climate change, so much talk about funding, and the question is, will these pledges really be met?
I mean, that's definitely the right question. We work with 18 governments across Africa, and when we meet government officials, it's invariably the first question they have when we talk to them about climate: where is the money that we were promised? We often see lots of big pledges, but obviously it's projects that we want to see. The money that's flowing at the moment is simply not enough. So Africa's climate investment needs are around $300 billion a year. At the moment, around 10% of that is actually flowing. And when you try and look at the reasons, we hear two different perspectives. When you speak to people in the West, countries in the West, they'll say, look, the money's there, but there just aren't the projects in Africa to invest into. But then when we speak to African government officials that we work with, we hear from them that we do have the projects, but you're simply not providing the money. And I think a lot of the work that's required is really around bridging that gap. And whilst it's important what happens in el-Sheikh and what happens through the UN process, because that sets the framework for this finance, I think it's also as important what happens in the African countries themselves. I think the onus is on the African government not to give the West any excuses not to get this money flowing. So, if the African governments can help by putting in place plans, addressing prerequisites for investment, once they do that, they really should be giving the West no excuse.
But Gareth, are there any role models when it comes to energy transition, whether you look at the African continent, the West, or even Asia, then that other countries can look up to? Because what we're seeing globally is really a damaged continent, a damaged world from the effects of climate change.
Yeah, we're seeing good examples. I mean, we're seeing a couple of good examples on the continent itself. So Egypt have been very clear that they want this COP to be an implementation COP, and they're setting an example with their own energy transition initiative. So they have a plan to deliver around 10 gigawatts of solar, investment in irrigation, investment in water desalination, and they've done a good job of packaging this, and they've secured commitments of financing from a number of high-profile Western investors. South Africa have also last year, they got an $8.5 billion pledge of support from the EU, Germany, the UK, the US. So I think there are examples of parts of this that are being done well. And then if you look beyond Africa, Indonesia have got a very robust plan for securing finance to accelerate the decommissioning of their coal plant, but also, and I think this is the critical thing for developing countries, establishing a domestic battery manufacturing capability. And I think for African countries, it's not enough for them to focus on mitigation, because frankly, African countries haven't really contributed to this crisis. For the African countries, it really should be about how can we use this money to drive other national objectives, be it job creation, industrialization, things like that.
And very briefly, how practical is it for governments to deliver energy transition reforms?
Well, I think if you're looking at Africa, the phrase energy transition needs a little bit of unpacking. So, we know the numbers. In Africa, 600 million people don't have access to electricity. A lot of the population, the majority of the population, uses firewood for cooking. So, whereas in a lot of the countries that I've just spoken about, the transition is moving away from coal, for example, to other forms of energy. In these African countries, it's much more fundamental. It's about establishing a functioning energy sector in different areas.
Gareth, thank you very much.